My name is Emma Lawson. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my career, I've worked in corporate finance as a senior financial analyst. I live in Chicago now, though I grew up in a small town in Ohio where being good with numbers was considered practical, not powerful. If you met me in the hallway at work, you probably wouldn't remember much about me. I don't speak the loudest in meetings. I don't dominate conversations. I don't dress to be noticed. I dress to be precise. Structured blazers, neutral colors, hair always pulled back. I learned early that when you're a woman in finance, calm competence is often mistaken for background noise. People tend to underestimate women like me. They assume we're diligent but not decisive, detail-oriented but not strategic, reliable but not dangerous. What they don't understand is that silence is not absence, and attention to detail is a form of power. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or explosive boardroom scandals. It's about something much quieter than that, something more unsettling. For 3 years, our company's profit numbers were flawless. Quarter after quarter, growth exceeded projections. Margins expanded in ways that felt almost mathematical in their elegance. Our CFO became something of a legend internally. Investors praised our discipline. Executives celebrated operational excellence. But numbers don't have moods. They don't perform. They don't try to impress anyone. They either tell the truth or they don't. At first, I thought my discomfort was insecurity. Maybe I just didn't understand the bigger strategic picture. Maybe the leadership team truly had discovered some extraordinary efficiency model I wasn't privy to. But the numbers began to feel too clean, too symmetrical. Losses that should have appeared in Q2 quietly drifted into Q3. Vendor liabilities hovered just below reporting thresholds. Risk exposure footnotes grew denser but somehow less visible. Everything technically compliant, nothing technically wrong. What looked like flawless growth hid manipulated entries, delayed losses, and risks buried just deep enough to fool everyone, until I followed the numbers to where they weren't meant to be seen. And that's when I realized something that changed, not only my career, but my identity. This story will take you through that journey, not the scandal itself, but the psychology behind it. What it feels like to be invisible long enough that people stop guarding themselves around you. What it means to choose silence, not out of fear, but strategy. And what happens when you decide to act, not loudly, not emotionally, but precisely. There will be no heroes here, no cartoon villains, just systems, incentives, and the quiet calculations people make when they believe no one is watching. I'm not proud of everything I felt during that time. I doubted myself. I rationalized what I was seeing. I wondered if speaking up would end my career before it ever truly began. But I also learned something about power. It doesn't always belong to the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the one who understands the numbers better than anyone else and is patient enough to let them speak. If you've ever sensed something was wrong but weren't sure whether to trust your instincts, if you've ever been underestimated so thoroughly that you started to believe it yourself, you might understand why I waited. Before we go further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever noticed a truth that others seem determined not to see? In the finance department, I wasn't a threat. I was a function. When I joined Alderwick Holdings, I came in as a senior financial analyst, mid-level, technically experienced, but not management. The kind of role that keeps the machinery moving, but never touches the steering wheel. To them, I was Emma from reporting, not Emma Lawson, CPA, not Emma who could model long-term risk exposure across multi-market portfolios. Just Emma, who sent the clean spreadsheets before board meetings. In meetings, I sat halfway down the table, not close enough to the executives to be called on casually, not far enough to be invisible entirely. I occupied the safe middle space, where you're useful but not influential. When discussions grew heated about forecasts or capital allocation, the executives debated philosophy, vision, expansion strategy, market positioning. Then someone would turn slightly and say, "Emma, can you confirm the variance on Q3 operating margins?" I would confirm it, precisely, calmly, without commentary. That was my role. Confirm, validate, recalculate, never reinterpret. I learned quickly how people categorize me. Reliable, detail-oriented, low ego. That last one was said as a compliment. I smiled when they said it. In performance reviews, I received consistent praise. Extremely accurate. Meticulous. A steady presence. I was told I had great long-term potential. Long-term potential is corporate language for not now. I didn't resent it, not at first, because invisibility has advantages. When people don't perceive you as ambitious, they relax around you. They speak more freely. They explain things carelessly. They CC you on emails they don't reread. And I noticed everything. But outwardly, I remained the same. Measured, polite, almost predictable. There was a rhythm to my days. Early mornings, black coffee, quarterly review decks, cross-checking entries from subsidiary accounts, adjusting accruals, flagging minor inconsistencies with neutral language. Just a small clarification needed here. Can you confirm the timing of this entry? I may be misunderstanding, but I learned to soften every observation, because early in my career, I had once questioned a projection directly in a meeting. I was 29 then. I had said, plainly, this forecast assumes a margin expansion that doesn't align with historical trend. The room had gone quiet. Not hostile, just cold. Afterward, my manager at the time pulled me aside. He didn't scold me. He advised me. You're right technically, he said. But timing matters. Delivery matters. You don't want to seem obstructive. Obstructive. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. So I adjusted. I learned that being right wasn't enough. You had to be right gently, right quietly, right in a way that didn't threaten the architecture of someone else's authority. By the time the perfect profit streak began, I had fully adapted. Quarter after quarter, we exceeded expectations. I built the variance analyses that highlighted our improvements. I prepared the supporting schedules that justified margin expansion. I formatted the visuals that made the growth appear almost poetic. And everyone celebrated. Our CFO, Daniel Mercer, became a symbol of disciplined leadership. Investors referenced his conservative yet innovative financial strategy. Internal emails praised cross-functional alignment. I was included in those praise threads. Shout out to Emma for flawless reporting support. Support. The word fit too well. I wasn't seen as someone who shaped the story, only someone who organized it. There were moments I almost enjoyed that role. There is comfort in being underestimated. Expectations are lower. Scrutiny is lighter. No one watches the quiet one too closely. But invisibility has a psychological cost. You begin to internalize the idea that your value exists only in execution, not in interpretation, not in judgment. I told myself I preferred it that way. Less politics, more precision. Yet sometimes during executive presentations, when Daniel would speak confidently about our disciplined financial posture, I would look at the underlying data on my laptop and feel something subtle. Not suspicion, not yet, just distance. The story being told in the room felt polished, elegant, controlled. The numbers on my screen felt alive. Numbers carry texture when you work with them long enough. They have patterns, weight, behavior. You begin to sense when something is aligned and when something is merely arranged. But at that stage, I didn't question it out loud. Because who was I? To them, I was the analyst who confirmed totals, the quiet one who didn't interrupt, the dependable presence who never challenged the narrative, only refined it. And when you play that role long enough, people forget you have a narrative of your own. They assume you're satisfied being adjacent to power. They don't realize you're studying it. Back then, I didn't know where that observation would lead me. I only knew this. They saw me as careful. They never considered that careful can also mean calculating. The first time something felt wrong, it wasn't dramatic. There was no secret meeting, no hidden document marked confidential. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April during our Q2 pre-close review. I had been reconciling regional revenue adjustments when I noticed a timing discrepancy in one of our European subsidiaries. A large client rebate, significant enough to impact margin by nearly 0.8%, had been recorded not in April, where the contract clearly placed it, but tentatively scheduled for July. At first, I assumed it was an administrative delay. So I sent a simple message to Ryan, the regional controller. Hi Ryan, just confirming the rebate for the Hanover contract. Should this sit in Q2 rather than Q3? I might be misreading the agreement. Neutral, soft, non-accusatory. He responded 30 minutes later. Intentional timing, cleared with Daniel. We're smoothing volatility, no impact long-term. Smoothing volatility. It sounded strategic, almost responsible. Still, I reopened the contract. The payment terms were explicit. Recognition in Q2. I stared at the spreadsheet longer than necessary. It wasn't illegal, not outright. Companies adjust timing within acceptable accounting frameworks all the time. Judgment calls exist in gray spaces. But this didn't feel like judgment. It felt deliberate. I walked down the hall later that afternoon when I saw Ryan near the coffee station. "Hey," I said casually. "Just wanted to double-check on that Hanover adjustment. It shifts our Q2 margin pretty noticeably." He didn't seem defensive. He seemed amused. "You worry too much, Emma," he said. "Finance isn't just math, it's strategy." There was a subtle shift in tone. Not cruel, not hostile. Just dismissive, as if I had revealed something naive. I nodded, smiled lightly. Got it. And that should have been the end of it. Except that evening, while updating the consolidated margin projection, I ran both scenarios, the Q2 recognition and the deferred Q3 version. The difference was clean, too clean. With the adjustment moved, Q2 landed precisely within the narrow band needed to beat guidance by 0.2%. Without it, we would have missed by 0.6%. Not catastrophic, but noticeable. I told myself it was coincidence. Leadership often manages expectations strategically. That's part of executive planning. But something about the precision unsettled me. It wasn't the adjustment itself. It was how easily it was brushed aside. "You worry too much." I had heard variations of that before. When I asked detailed questions in meetings, when I flagged risk footnotes, others considered minor. When I requested supporting documentation before finalizing reports. There's a particular way competence in women gets reframed as anxiety. I didn't confront it. Instead, I saved a copy of the original contract terms in a private folder, not as evidence, just for clarity. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing similar micro-adjustments. Expense accruals nudged forward. Vendor liabilities categorized under broader headings. Revenue recognition, interpretations that lean consistently in one direction. Individually, each decision could be justified. Collectively, they formed a pattern. Still, no one else seemed concerned. During executive review, Daniel presented the numbers confidently. "Our operational discipline continues to drive stable margin expansion." The board nodded. I sat at the edge of the conference table with my laptop open, watching the slide transitions I had formatted myself. I told myself that if there were a real issue, someone more senior would catch it. Internal audit, external auditors, the CFO's own team. That was their responsibility. Mine was execution, but something shifted quietly inside me that week. Not outrage, not fear, awareness. The first small cut wasn't the accounting entry. It was the realization that when I raised a question, it didn't trigger discussion. It triggered dismissal, and dismissal is information. It tells you where you stand in a hierarchy. From that point on, I didn't stop looking. I just stopped asking as many questions out loud. After the Hanover adjustment, nothing exploded. There was no sudden collapse, no glaring red flag. Instead, there was something more subtle and more dangerous. Normalization. Once you allow one strategic timing decision, the next one feels less significant. In May, a supplier liability that should have tightened our operating margin appeared under a broader deferred expense category. Technically defensible, aggressively interpreted. In June, an underperforming regional unit received a temporary internal transfer that elevated its quarterly performance just enough to avoid scrutiny. Each time I ran the numbers twice. Each time the pattern held. Losses drifted, gains accelerated, volatility softened. On paper, we looked extraordinary. In reality, we were rearranging impact. The dismissals became more refined too. During one pre-close session, I mentioned that our free cash flow variance seemed inconsistent with the revenue narrative. Daniel glanced at me briefly, then continued speaking to the VP of Operations. "We've already aligned on that," he said smoothly. "The model accounts for timing differences." The model. That phrase became a shield. If the model accounted for it, then questioning the outcome meant questioning the model. And questioning the model meant questioning leadership. After the meeting, a colleague, Melissa from FP&A, leaned toward me and whispered, "You always notice the tension first." I gave her a small smile. "It's just math." She hesitated. "Just be careful." Careful. The word echoed differently this time. Not advice about tone, a warning about positioning. That's when I began recognizing a pattern in how I was treated. I was consulted for verification, not interpretation. Asked to confirm figures, not evaluate strategy. My emails were answered when they required calculations, ignored when they required perspective. It wasn't overt hostility. It was containment, and slowly I adjusted again. When something didn't align, I documented it quietly. When a number shifted, I archived the earlier version. When a rationale felt vague, I saved the email explanation. Not out of rebellion, out of instinct. There's a psychological process that happens when you're consistently minimized. You start editing yourself before others do. I stopped raising questions in large meetings. I redirected them privately. I softened language further. I might be missing context. Just a minor clarification. Probably nothing. And the more I minimized my own observations, the easier it became for others to minimize them too. By mid-year, our profit streak had become a talking point in industry publications. Analysts praised our stability in volatile markets. Inside the department, there was a subtle pride. "We've cracked the code," someone joked in the break room. I smiled along, but I couldn't ignore the tightening in my chest each time I reviewed the consolidated ledger. The numbers weren't wrong enough to collapse. They were wrong just enough to impress. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, I stayed late to reconcile a multi-quarter summary Daniel planned to present at an investor conference. When I adjusted for deferred losses that had been pushed forward, the growth curve changed shape. It didn't crash. It simply flattened. Realistic. Human. I stared at both versions side by side, the polished narrative and the unfiltered one. For a moment, I wondered if I was overreacting. Corporate finance is built on interpretation. Timing differences are normal. Strategic presentation isn't fraud. But intent leaves fingerprints, and this felt intentional. The hardest part wasn't the numbers. It was the isolation, because technically nothing was blatantly illegal. No one was forging documents. No one was inventing revenue from nothing. We were simply choosing the most flattering interpretation every single time. And when patterns repeat without resistance, they become culture. By July, I noticed something else. When discussions arose about risk, my name stopped being included in early drafts. I would receive finalized summaries rather than preliminary analyses. It was subtle, but clear. The fewer questions I asked publicly, the less I was looped in strategically. Containment had evolved into quiet exclusion, and I had to confront something uncomfortable. My silence was protecting them more than it was protecting me. Still, I didn't escalate. Not yet, because escalation requires certainty, and I was still navigating doubt. Was I witnessing manipulation, or simply aggressive management? The line between the two can be thin, and career-ending if misjudged. So I stayed. I observed. I refined my documentation process, and outwardly, I remained the same Emma. Precise, cooperative, non-confrontational. They believed the dismissals had worked. They didn't realize they had changed something else instead. They had removed my need for validation, and once you stop needing validation, you start seeking clarity. By the end of that summer, I understood something clearly. I had been assigned a role, not formally, not in writing, but structurally. Every organization distributes identities the way it distributes responsibilities. There are visionaries. There are operators. There are protectors of culture. And then there are the quiet technicians. I was the technician, reliable, contained, non-threatening. The one you trust with sensitive spreadsheets, but not sensitive decisions. The pattern became obvious during strategic planning meetings for the next fiscal year. I was invited to prepare the long-range financial projections, build the models, stress test the assumptions. But when the executive team debated those assumptions, I wasn't asked to stay. "Thanks, Emma. We'll take it from here." Take it from here, as if insight began only after the math ended. I would pack my laptop, nod politely, and leave the conference room while the door closed softly behind me. At first, I told myself this was hierarchy. Normal corporate layering. Analysts model, executives decide. But something about the dynamic felt narrower than hierarchy. It felt curated. My presence was welcomed where precision was required. It was minimized where influence could shift outcomes. Even casual interactions reinforced it. During a team lunch, someone joked about how I probably color-code my grocery list. Another chimed in, "Emma's the human calculator. If she says it balances, it balances." I smiled, because that's what you do. But beneath the humor was a boundary. They saw me as function, not force. And the more I leaned into calm competence, the more secure they felt in that assumption. Around this time, Daniel began publicly praising the discipline of our finance team. He often used phrases like, "We don't get emotional about numbers. We stay objective. We manage optics responsibly." Optics. That word stayed with me. Optics are about perception, not substance. In one internal memo, he wrote, "Consistency builds investor confidence." True, but consistency manufactured through timing shifts is not discipline. It's choreography. I began to notice how carefully my workload was structured. I handled consolidation, margin analytics, variance reporting, but I was not assigned independent review authority over revenue recognition policies. That responsibility remained tightly centralized, strategic, contained. I realized then that my invisibility wasn't accidental. It was useful. A meticulous analyst who doesn't challenge authority publicly is an asset. She enhances credibility without destabilizing narrative. I thought about the word obstructive again, the one I had been cautioned against years earlier. In trying not to be obstructive, I had become predictable, and predictability is comforting to those shaping outcomes. One evening, while reviewing year-to-date performance, I ran a cumulative reconciliation across 4 quarters, removing every deferred adjustment and timing shift. The growth curve transformed. Still positive, but volatile. Human, real. I stared at the recalculated projection for a long time. Then I closed the file, because here was the truth I had to face. As long as I stayed in the role assigned to me, nothing would change. If I continued being the careful technician, I would retire with clean spreadsheets and no impact. If I disrupted the narrative prematurely, I could lose credibility before I gathered enough clarity. That was the tension. I wasn't angry. I was aware. They expected me to remain reliable, useful, invisible. They trusted that I valued stability over confrontation. And at that moment, they were right. But something subtle was shifting. Not externally, internally. The role I had been assigned depended on my compliance. And compliance, I realized, is a choice. I didn't know yet what I would do. I only knew that I was no longer comfortable being a supporting character in a story built on selective truth. The technician had seen the pattern. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. The shift didn't happen during a scandal. It happened on a quiet Wednesday morning in October. No raised voices, no emergency meetings, no sudden discovery. Just a spreadsheet. I was alone in a small conference room reviewing preliminary Q4 projections. The blinds were half closed, casting thin bands of light across the table. My laptop screen glowed with columns of numbers that, by then, felt almost familiar in their choreography. Revenue slightly accelerated, expenses slightly delayed, margins gently protected. Predictable. I wasn't looking for errors anymore, I was looking for rhythm. And then I saw something small. A deferred write-down tied to an acquisition we had completed 18 months earlier. The integration had underperformed from the beginning. Internal forecasts never fully matched reality. We had absorbed minor impairments gradually, distributing impact across quarters. But this entry was different. It wasn't large enough to trigger alarm. It was placed just beneath a reporting threshold that would have required explicit investor commentary. The timing aligned perfectly with an upcoming earnings call. I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't about smoothing volatility anymore. This was about narrative management, and in that moment, something inside me settled. Not with panic, but with clarity. I stopped asking, "Is this acceptable?" and started asking, "Is this honest?" There is a difference. Acceptable behavior operates within rules. Honest behavior operates within integrity. For months, I had been trying to determine whether what I was seeing crossed legal boundaries. That morning, I realized legality wasn't the only line that mattered. If the market understood our true exposure, our stock would dip. If investors saw cumulative risk concentration, confidence would soften. Leadership wasn't protecting stability. They were protecting perception. I opened a blank worksheet and began reconstructing our performance history without adjustments. No deferred losses, no optimized timing, no selective categorization, just raw sequence. When I graphed the result, it didn't look catastrophic. It looked vulnerable. Growth, yes, but uneven. Margins expanding, but strained. Cash flow healthy, but pressured. It looked like a company navigating real conditions, which meant the polished version wasn't survival. It was presentation. And for the first time, I felt something steady replace doubt. Not anger, not fear. Responsibility. Because I understood something else that morning. If this continued long enough, the gap between presentation and reality would widen. And when gaps widen in finance, they don't close gently. They collapse. The shift wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about refusing to pretend I didn't see it. Up until that day, I had been balancing 2 instincts. Protect your career, protect the truth. That morning, I realized those instincts might eventually collide. And if they did, I needed to know which one defined me. I closed the conference room door, not because I was hiding, but because I needed quiet. I reviewed every quarterly report from the past 3 years. Patterns strengthened. Small deferrals accumulated. Risk footnotes grew denser but less specific. Language softened where numbers hardened. No single entry would trigger regulatory action, but collectively, the architecture leaned forward. I thought about Daniel's phrase, "We don't get emotional about numbers." He was right. Numbers aren't emotional. But people are. People fear market reactions. They fear investor doubt. They fear reputational damage. And fear creates incentives. That Wednesday, something crystallized for me. I wasn't the quiet technician anymore. I was the only person mapping the full picture without performance filters. And that realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel accountable. I printed the unfiltered performance summary and placed it inside a plain folder. No dramatic labeling, no confrontation, just documentation. Then I went back to my desk and continued working as usual. Answered emails, updated models, prepared slide drafts. Nothing about my demeanor changed. But internally, a line had been crossed. Silence was no longer uncertainty. It was preparation, because once you accept that a system is misaligned, you have two choices: adapt to it, or understand it deeply enough to decide what to do next. That morning, I chose understanding. And understanding, when pursued fully, changes everything. After that October morning, I stopped hoping someone else would notice. That hope had been comforting. It allowed me to stay passive, to believe oversight mechanisms would activate before consequences did. But now I understood something essential. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Leadership optimized optics. Managers protected leadership. Teams executed tasks within defined boundaries. And I had been living inside those boundaries. From that point on, my silence was no longer hesitation. It was intentional. Externally, nothing about me changed. I continued preparing reports, continued validating margins, continued sending concise emails that contained only what was required. If anything, I became more agreeable, less questioning in group settings, more efficient in turnaround times. I knew what they saw when they looked at me: steady, predictable, safe. That perception was now an asset. When people believe you're compliant, they stop filtering around you, and the filtering around me began to thin. I was included in earlier drafts again, perhaps because I wasn't raising friction publicly. Internal discussion threads circulated with more context. I was copied on rationale explanations that previously happened verbally behind closed doors. Silence had reduced perceived threat, and perceived threat governs access. I began structuring my work differently. Instead of only reviewing final quarterly consolidations, I tracked entries at the source level. I mapped adjustments across subsidiaries before they were rolled up. I documented timing shifts in a parallel file that existed outside the shared drive, not to sabotage, to understand sequence. I noticed patterns in language too. When an expense was moved, the justification often referenced operational alignment. When revenue was accelerated, the phrase reflecting forward-looking momentum appeared. When risk exposure increased, it was described as manageable within current capital structure. Language and numbers were evolving together. I started saving executive memos alongside the financial entries they referenced. Narrative and math side by side. It became almost clinical. I wasn't trying to catch anyone. I was constructing clarity. There's a difference between suspicion and evidence. Suspicion feels emotional. Evidence feels structural. And structure is harder to dismiss. One afternoon, Melissa asked if I had noticed how consistently our quarterly earnings exceeded analyst consensus by narrow margins. Every time, she said. It's almost surgical. I tilted my head slightly. We manage expectations well. She laughed lightly. You sound like Daniel. I didn't respond, because I had realized something else. Silence changes how others categorize you. Earlier in the year, my questions had branded me as cautious. Now my restraint branded me as aligned. An alignment grants proximity. In November, I was asked to assist directly in preparing the earnings call script. A first for me. Not to write it, to fact-check it. That was enough. For the first time, I saw how carefully phrases were constructed. Strategic timing decisions, disciplined capital allocation, short-term volatility absorbed to maintain long-term shareholder value. Each statement technically accurate, collectively curated. I reviewed every number referenced in the script against my parallel reconstruction file. The divergence between narrative and raw performance was widening. Still defensible, but fragile. And here's the truth I rarely admit. There were moments I considered doing nothing. If the company continued performing well enough, perhaps the smoothing would never escalate. Perhaps reality would catch up to presentation before the gap became dangerous. But deep down, I knew gaps do not shrink on their own. They expand quietly. And when they expand, they demand resolution. By December, my private documentation file had grown thick with time-stamped exports, reconciliations, and email threads. I kept it on an encrypted personal drive, not because I planned to expose it, because I refused to be the only one without a complete record. Silence at this stage was no longer protective camouflage. It was positioning. They mistook my calm for compliance. They mistook my reduced questions for trust. They believed I had settled comfortably into the role assigned to me. They didn't realize that the less I spoke publicly, the more I was learning privately. And learning changes leverage. I still hadn't decided what I would do, but I knew one thing with certainty. If a moment came where truth required defense, I would not be standing there with assumptions. I would be standing there with architecture. And architecture, once built, does not disappear quietly. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. By January, no one perceived me as resistant anymore. I had adapted fully to the rhythm of the department. Deadlines were met early. Reports were flawless. My tone in meetings was even softer than before. I let them believe I had settled. What they never noticed was how my curiosity had changed direction. Instead of asking, why did this happen? I began asking, who benefits from this timing? Instead of reviewing quarters in isolation, I mapped multi-year sequences. Instead of focusing on compliance thresholds, I studied behavioral patterns. Preparation became systematic. First, I reconstructed 3 full fiscal years without timing optimizations. I built an independent performance model using raw transaction data before executive-level adjustments. It required longer hours, but I framed it internally as stress testing. No one questions extra diligence. Second, I categorized adjustments by type: revenue acceleration, expense deferral, risk reclassification, narrative softening. Each category had recurring fingerprints, same phrasing, similar timing windows, consistent executive approvals. Third, I began examining incentive structures. Executive bonuses were partially tied to quarterly EPS targets and margin stability metrics. The smoothing wasn't random. It was rewarded. That realization didn't shock me. It clarified motive. Motives don't make people evil. They make behavior predictable. And predictability can be modeled. There's something powerful about recognizing that a system is not chaotic. It's optimized toward incentives. Once you understand incentives, you can anticipate outcomes. I began forecasting not only revenue, but likely narrative adjustments. If Q1 underperformed organically, I could predict where timing shifts would emerge. If a regional unit struggled, I could anticipate internal transfers before they appeared, and often I was correct. That predictability unsettled me more than the adjustments themselves, because it meant the pattern was entrenched. In February, I attended a cross-department strategy session. Normally, I would have spoken little. This time I spoke even less, but I listened carefully. Operations mentioned supply chain cost increases that hadn't yet appeared in financial projections. Sales hinted at contract renegotiations that would compress margins later in the year. Yet the executive forecast presented confidence in stable expansion. The divergence between forward-looking language and underlying risk grew sharper. I wrote nothing down during the meeting, but later that evening, I reconstructed the discussion from memory and aligned it against the numbers. Preparation isn't only data collection. It's contextual layering. By March, I had something more than suspicion. I had a structural map, a documented timeline of adjustments, a pattern of executive approvals, a quantified gap between optimized reporting and raw performance, and importantly, no illegal fabrication. That distinction mattered deeply to me, because I wasn't uncovering fraud in the dramatic sense. I was uncovering managed perception. And managed perception, when compounded, can distort markets. The more clarity I gained, the calmer I became. Anxiety thrives in uncertainty. Clarity removes drama. At work, I was still Emma from reporting, still dependable, still precise. Daniel once remarked during a meeting, "Emma's models are airtight. If she signs off, we're good." The room nodded. I nodded too. He didn't know that I was signing off on 2 parallel realities, the official one and the reconstructed one. What they never noticed was how my posture had shifted, not physically, but internally. I no longer sought inclusion. I no longer sought validation. I sought completeness. One afternoon, Melissa asked if I ever considered moving into management. "You're more strategic than you let on," she said. I smiled faintly. "Strategy requires authority." She looked at me thoughtfully. "Or leverage." That word lingered. Leverage doesn't require loudness. It requires a symmetry of information. And by that point, information asymmetry was tilting quietly in my favor. But leverage is dangerous if misused. I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. I wasn't interested in destroying the company. I cared about stability, real stability, the kind built on transparency, not choreography. So I asked myself a difficult question. What outcome would correct the trajectory without detonating the system? That question guided my preparation. I reviewed whistleblower policies. I studied board governance structures. I analyzed regulatory disclosure requirements, not because I intended to escalate immediately, because I needed to understand options before emotion forced my hand. Preparation is power only if paired with restraint, and restraint was something I had mastered long ago. By the end of Q1 close, my private documentation file was no longer just a collection of entries. It was a narrative, chronological, quantified, contextualized. If someone neutral reviewed it, they would see a pattern, not chaos. They would see incentives influencing presentation. They would see risk masked as discipline. And most importantly, they would see evidence, not accusation. What they never noticed was that my invisibility had matured into perspective. They believed I was still confirming totals. They didn't realize I had reconstructed the architecture. And architecture, once fully mapped, offers choices. The kind of choices that don't require shouting. The kind that don't require revenge. Only timing. The reveal wasn't public. It wasn't dramatic. It happened at my dining table on a Sunday evening in early April, with my laptop open and a quiet kind of certainty settling into place. For months, I had been documenting patterns, adjustments, incentives, language shifts, timing decisions that leaned consistently in one direction. But documentation alone isn't leverage. Clarity is. That night, I did something different. Instead of reviewing quarter by quarter, I aggregated everything into a single cumulative model, 3 years of performance reconstructed without smoothing. Then I layered executive compensation triggers on top of it. The alignment was precise. Each time our reported margin narrowly exceeded guidance, bonus multipliers increased. Each time volatility was dampened below a certain threshold, long-term incentive metrics strengthened. The company wasn't collapsing. It was being optimized for executive stability. And I understood something with complete calm. If the board saw this cumulative reconstruction side by side with incentive triggers and adjustment timing, it would raise questions. Not about fraud, about governance. That distinction mattered. Governance failures don't always require criminal intent. They require misalignment between presentation and oversight. I printed 2 versions of the same timeline, one showing reported performance, one showing reconstructed raw performance. The divergence widened gradually, not sharply enough to alarm an external observer, but clearly enough to concern someone trained to read patterns. I sat back in my chair and felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not anger, relief, because the doubt was gone. For months, I had wondered whether I was projecting patterns onto noise, whether my caution was simply personality, whether I was, as Ryan had implied, worrying too much. But the data didn't worry. It aligned, and alignment removed self-doubt. The private reveal wasn't discovering wrongdoing. It was discovering certainty. Certainty that the smoothing was systematic. Certainty that incentives reinforced it. Certainty that continued compounding would eventually create a credibility fracture. And then came the more difficult realization. I had leverage, not the kind that humiliates, the kind that rebalances power. If I escalated publicly, markets could react harshly. Reputation damage would ripple outward. Employees, investors, vendors. If I confronted Daniel directly, the narrative could be reframed as interpretation differences. If I stayed silent, the pattern would continue until an external shock forced correction. There was one path that didn't rely on confrontation: board audit committee review. Quiet, procedural, structural. But before deciding, I needed to confirm one final variable: materiality. I spent the next week stress testing scenarios under adverse market conditions. If revenue growth slowed even modestly, previously deferred risks would surface faster. Margin protection mechanisms would strain. Under a downturn, the divergence between reported stability and actual resilience would compress violently. That scenario changed everything, because smoothing works in stable conditions. It collapses in volatility. And volatility is not hypothetical. It is cyclical. That was the moment I understood the real risk. The issue wasn't past presentation. It was future fragility. The system had become dependent on continuous optimization. Without it, the optics would crack. And dependency is vulnerability. On Thursday evening, I closed my office door and reviewed my documentation one final time. Time-stamped exports, executive approval emails, compensation metric overlays, risk exposure summaries. Everything cross-referenced, everything objective, no emotional commentary, no accusations, just structure. I realized something else quietly. They trusted me. Daniel trusted my accuracy. The team trusted my discretion. My reputation inside the department was built on steadiness. If I escalated recklessly, that trust would vanish. But if I escalated methodically, using governance channels designed for oversight, The focus would shift from personality to process, and process cannot be dismissed as easily as emotion. The private reveal wasn't a secret uncovered in a dark room. It was a threshold crossed internally, from observer to decision maker, from technician to architect, from silence as compliance to silence as strategy. That Sunday evening, I saved the final reconstruction file under a neutral name, Performance Integrity Review. Not dramatic, not accusatory, accurate. I closed my laptop and felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Because uncertainty creates anxiety, but clarity, even when inconvenient, creates steadiness. I wasn't angry at Daniel. I understood him. Incentives shape behavior. Markets reward consistency. Leaders protect image. But governance exists for a reason, to protect the company from itself. And now I knew exactly where the pressure point lived. Not in a single accounting entry. In the cumulative pattern. Leverage doesn't feel loud. It feels quiet. Like standing on solid ground while others believe you're still balancing. And I was no longer balancing. I was deciding. Once clarity settles, delay becomes a choice. For weeks after completing the reconstruction, I didn't act. I went to work, closed Q1, reviewed adjustments, answered emails with the same measured tone. Externally, nothing shifted. Internally, everything had. When you possess leverage, the most dangerous impulse is to use it quickly, just to relieve the tension of holding it. I resisted that impulse. Instead, I mapped options. Option 1, do nothing. Continue documenting quietly. Allow the smoothing to persist and trust that natural market conditions would eventually correct the trajectory. The risk? If correction came abruptly, I would have known and remained silent. Option 2, confront Daniel directly. Present the cumulative model privately. Frame it as governance risk, not accusation. The risk? He could interpret it as insubordination. Or worse, reposition the narrative and tighten access before I secured oversight visibility. Option 3, escalate through formal internal channels. The audit committee existed precisely for performance integrity oversight. Independent directors, confidential reporting lines, structured review protocols. The risk, irreversibility. Once raised, such concerns do not disappear quietly. They create record. They trigger process. There is no undoing that. For several nights, I lay awake thinking about intent. I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't want headlines. I wanted structural correction before fragility turned into crisis. That distinction guided me. If my motive had been revenge for dismissal or marginalization, I would have chosen confrontation. Emotional release disguised as courage. But this wasn't emotional. It was architectural. I revisited my documentation and asked a harder question. If I present this to an independent governance body, can it withstand scrutiny without me narrating it? If the answer had been no, I would have waited. But the answer was yes. The data spoke in sequence. Adjustments aligned with incentive triggers. Risk accumulation was measurable. No dramatization required. The final variable was personal cost. I understood corporate dynamics well enough to know that even if protected legally, my position would shift. Trust would fracture. Career trajectory would change. Quiet dominance is not without sacrifice. So I asked myself one final question. 5 years from now, if volatility exposed this pattern publicly, could I respect the version of myself who stayed silent? The answer came faster than I expected. No, not because silence would be cowardice, but because clarity creates responsibility. One Tuesday morning in late April, I drafted a concise memorandum addressed to the chair of the audit committee. No emotional framing, no loaded language. Subject, review request, performance timing and incentive alignment. I attached 3 documents. Reported versus reconstructed 3-year performance comparison. Adjustment categorization with timestamps and approvals. Executive compensation trigger overlay analysis. The body of the memo was 4 paragraphs. I stated that I believed cumulative timing decisions, while individually compliant, created governance risk by masking performance volatility and concentrating deferred exposure. I recommended an independent review to ensure long-term stability. I did not accuse. I did not speculate. I requested oversight. Before sending it, I paused. There is a specific kind of stillness that precedes irreversible decisions. Not fear, finality. I reread the memo once more. It was measured, structured, professional. Then I submitted it through the confidential governance channel designated for financial integrity concerns. No dramatic send-off. No visible shift in expression. I closed my laptop and walked into the next meeting as if nothing had happened. Because in many ways, nothing had yet. The decision point isn't loud. It's quiet. It happens in a single click. Afterward, there is no rush of adrenaline. only steadiness. I didn't know how long review protocols would take. I didn't know whether the audit committee would escalate immediately or request clarification. But I knew this. I had chosen the irreversible path, not to expose but to correct. And correction, once initiated within governance structures, moves differently than confrontation. It moves slowly, precisely, and without spectacle. Back at my desk, I updated the quarterly margin summary as usual. Numbers aligned, slides formatted, deadlines met. No one looked at me differently, because nothing visible had changed. But the architecture had shifted. Oversight now had access to the full pattern, and patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. If anyone expected fireworks, after I submitted the memo, they would have been disappointed. Governance doesn't erupt. It unfolds. The first response came 5 days later, an acknowledgement from the audit committee chair confirming receipt and requesting a confidential meeting. No tone, no emotion. Procedural. I scheduled it for early the following week, outside normal executive reporting cycles. I used a neutral conference room on a different floor, one typically reserved for external consultants. Nothing about my daily routine changed. That was essential. When people anticipate disruption, they look for behavioral shifts, withdrawal, tension, overcompensation. I offered none. I continued collaborating with Daniel on Q2 projections, continued refining slide language for the upcoming earnings preview, continued responding to minor adjustments with the same calm professionalism. Inside, however, I began preparing for scrutiny, not of them, of me. Whenever governance is activated, credibility becomes currency. I reviewed every document I had submitted, anticipating questions. Why now? Why you? Why not raise this internally first? The answers were factual. Now, because cumulative divergence had reached structural significance. Me, because I had full consolidation visibility. Not internally, because leadership directly benefited from the pattern. Emotion never entered the explanation. The meeting with the audit chair lasted 90 minutes. He was measured, direct, experienced. He didn't accuse. He didn't defend. He asked for clarification on methodology. How did you reconstruct baseline performance? Which entries are compliant but pattern relevant? Are you alleging misstatement? No, I replied calmly. I am alleging incentive-shaped presentation risk. That distinction shifted the tone. Governance committees are not only concerned with legality, they are concerned with long-term exposure. By the end of the meeting, he requested supporting exports and asked whether I was comfortable maintaining confidentiality during preliminary review. I am, I said, and I meant it. Silence remained strategic. Over the next 2 weeks, subtle things began to happen, not publicly, but procedurally. An independent accounting advisory firm was engaged under the pretext of a routine internal control review. Documentation requests expanded across departments. Timing decisions were examined with more granularity than usual. Daniel appeared unaware at first, or perhaps he sensed something but couldn't localize it. He remained composed in meetings, still confident in projections, but I noticed a change in his questions. He began requesting deeper backup for margin assumptions, asked controllers to justify adjustments with written summaries. The system had begun tightening around itself. No one connected it to me. Why would they? My behavior hadn't shifted. I still signed off on models, still attended meetings, still contributed analytical refinements. Quiet dominance isn't about revealing leverage. It's about letting structure apply pressure naturally. As the review deepened, certain deferred losses were revisited. A proposed expense shift was reversed before final consolidation. Small corrections, invisible to outsiders, but meaningful internally. I did not celebrate. This wasn't victory. It was recalibration. One afternoon, Melissa mentioned that external advisors were being unusually thorough. Feels intense for a standard review, she said. I responded evenly. Stronger controls are good for everyone. And that was true. By mid-quarter, the audit committee scheduled a formal executive session without management present. That was significant. Still, no confrontation, no accusations, just governance exercising its mandate. In parallel, I continued my work with discipline. It would have been easy to withdraw emotionally, to feel separate from the system, but detachment can signal motive. I remained integrated because the goal was not to dismantle. It was to stabilize. Over time, volatility in reported projections became slightly more visible. Margins tightened by small degrees. Language in internal memos shifted from consistent expansion to disciplined navigation. Subtle, but real. The architecture was adjusting. Daniel grew quieter in forecasting meetings, more cautious in phrasing. He requested scenario modeling under less optimistic conditions. Whether he suspected oversight pressure or sensed emerging fragility, I couldn't know. But the performance choreography had lost some of its polish, and that was enough. The most powerful movements often look like stillness from the outside. No headlines, no scandal, just gravity redistributing weight. I never raised my voice. I never accused. I moved within the system designed to protect integrity and allowed it to function. And the longer it functioned, the more the narrative began to soften. Not collapse. Soften, because sustainable strength doesn't require perfection. It requires truth. And truth was quietly reclaiming space. The consequences didn't arrive as accusations. They arrived as discomfort. By the time Q2 earnings approached, the internal tone had shifted noticeably. Forecast meetings lasted longer. Assumptions were challenged more frequently. Documentation standards tightened across every subsidiary. No one announced a reason, but everyone felt the weight. Daniel, once fluid and assured in presentation rehearsals, now paused before certain projections. "Let's pressure test that scenario," he would say. "Run the conservative case again." 3 months earlier, that caution would have been dismissed as unnecessary pessimism. Now, it was prudent. The independent advisors had completed their preliminary review. Their language, carefully neutral, highlighted systemic reliance on discretionary timing judgments and recommended enhanced governance oversight for incentive-aligned reporting. No one used the word manipulation. They didn't need to. The board responded by adjusting internal controls and requiring audit committee pre-clearance for certain margin-impacting adjustments. Operationally, it was subtle. Psychologically, it was seismic. Because what had once been routine now required justification beyond executive approval. I watched the shift unfold quietly. Controllers hesitated before proposing deferrals. Emails that once contained smooth phrasing now included more precise qualifiers, within acceptable interpretation. Subject to audit committee review. Language stiffened. Volatility in Q2 results became visible. Not catastrophic, but less polished. For the first time in 3 years, we narrowly missed analyst consensus by 0.3%. The stock dipped briefly. Internally, tension thickened. No one connected the dip to timing corrections publicly. The official narrative referenced temporary integration headwinds and market recalibration. But I saw the difference. This wasn't weakness. It was exposure, and exposure, when controlled, strengthened systems. The personal consequences began subtly. Daniel's tone toward the team grew more formal. Fewer jokes, more distance. He requested independent validation for certain projections, bypassing informal trust. Trust had shifted from individuals to process. One afternoon, I noticed he no longer said, "If Emma signs off, we're good." Instead, he said, "Ensure documentation meets committee standards." That small linguistic shift told me everything. He didn't know it was me, but he knew something had changed. Melissa confided one day, "Feels like leadership's under a microscope." I nodded slightly. Governance cycles tighten sometimes. She studied me for a moment. "You don't seem surprised." I held her gaze evenly. Finance rewards predictability. She didn't press further. Inside, I felt neither guilt nor triumph, only steadiness. Because the consequences unfolding weren't punitive. They were corrective. Executive bonuses for the upcoming cycle were recalibrated. Greater weight was placed on multi-year stability metrics rather than quarterly EPS precision. That single governance adjustment altered incentive gravity. When incentives change, behavior follows. In subsequent forecast meetings, projections became more conservative organically. Margin guidance widened slightly to allow for natural fluctuation. The choreography softened. No one announced a moral reckoning. No dramatic apology occurred, just gradual alignment. But not everyone adapted comfortably. Certain managers who had benefited most from timing flexibility expressed frustration privately. "We're tying our own hands," one complained in a corridor conversation. Another muttered, "Overcorrection." That's the irony of governance. Those accustomed to discretion interpret oversight as restriction. Those focused on resilience interpret it as protection. Externally, investors responded cautiously at first. The stock stabilized after the initial dip. Analysts noted increased transparency in volatility disclosure. Transparency, a word that had been absent from internal praise threads for years. And then came the deeper consequence, one I had anticipated. Performance no longer felt effortless. Without smoothing, quarters required more disciplined cost management and operational efficiency. Real work replaced presentation work. The company wasn't weaker. It was more honest. But honesty removes the illusion of perfection. And perfection had been a source of pride. Daniel's public demeanor remained composed. He framed the tightened controls as proactive governance enhancement, which technically was true. He never accused anyone internally. He never sought a culprit. That told me something important. He understood the structural risk, too. He simply hadn't wanted to acknowledge it first. The consequences continued quietly, spreading through policy revisions, incentive realignments, and language recalibration. No explosion, no scandal, just gravity asserting itself. And through it all, I remained what I had always appeared to be: calm, precise, invisible, except now invisibility carried weight, because I had watched the architecture bend and hold, and the system, though strained, had chosen correction over collapse. Correction came quietly, but realization did not. By the time Q3 approached, the cumulative impact of tightened oversight was fully visible internally. Margin guidance had widened again. Volatility disclosures in investor materials became more explicit. Deferred exposures, once gently redistributed, now surfaced more directly. Nothing catastrophic happened, but the illusion of effortless precision was gone. And for some, that loss felt heavier than any financial dip. The advisory firm delivered its final governance memo to the board. I never saw the full document, but I knew its tone from the questions that followed. It wasn't accusatory. It was diagnostic. Excessive reliance on discretionary timing within compliant boundaries. Incentive misalignment creating short-term smoothing bias. Recommendation: strengthened oversight, revised compensation triggers. No one was labeled unethical, but the pattern had been formally acknowledged. And once governance formalizes a pattern, culture shifts. Daniel called a department-wide meeting shortly after the memo circulated among senior leadership. His demeanor was steady, but more restrained than usual. "We are enhancing our internal review protocols," he said. Not because anything was wrong, but because long-term excellence requires discipline. That phrasing was intentional. Not because anything was wrong. It was a protective sentence, but everyone in the room understood that something had in fact been wrong. Not illegally, not flagrantly, but structurally. After the meeting, corridors hummed with speculation. Did audit find something? Why are bonuses being recalculated? Feels like someone triggered this. No one asked me directly. Why would they? I had remained consistent, unreactive, unchanged. But I sensed something else emerging beneath the surface. Regret. Not dramatic regret, not confession, strategic regret. Certain deferred write-downs could no longer be postponed under the new review framework. A cumulative impairment tied to that underperforming acquisition finally surfaced in full. The quarterly report reflected it cleanly. The stock dipped again, this time more noticeably. Analysts described it as a necessary recalibration. Necessary. That word carries weight. It means the adjustment was inevitable. And inevitability reframes history. If something is inevitable, then the attempt to delay it becomes visible in retrospect. That's when I understood the deeper consequence. Even though the company was stabilizing, the narrative of invincibility had fractured. Investor trust didn't collapse, but it matured. Questions became sharper during earnings calls. Risk discussions grew longer. Daniel handled them professionally. He never deflected. He answered carefully. But the aura of flawless execution had faded. An aura, once lost, cannot be reconstructed through presentation. One afternoon, I passed Daniel in the hallway. He paused briefly. "We've been evolving," he said evenly. "Change isn't always comfortable." "No," I replied, "but it can be stabilizing." Our eye contact held for a fraction longer than usual. Did he suspect? I couldn't tell. But I sensed recognition, not of me specifically, but of the system adjusting beyond his control. Too late to fix it. That phrase isn't about disaster. It's about trajectory. By the time governance intervenes, the pattern has already shaped culture. Bonuses had been paid in previous cycles. Market perception had been built on curated steadiness. Internal habits had formed around optimization. Those effects couldn't be erased. They could only be redirected, and redirection requires humility. Some executives adapted, others resisted quietly. A few senior managers chose to leave within months, citing strategic realignment. Publicly, transitions were framed as natural evolution. Privately, they felt like aftershocks. Through it all, I remained still. Because the goal had never been exposure. It had been prevention. Had I acted earlier, perhaps less volatility would have accumulated. Had I waited longer, perhaps correction would have been harsher. Timing matters. In finance, in governance, in courage. The company survived. But it was no longer performing perfection. It was performing resilience, and resilience is harder to fake. As Q4 approached, forecasts were conservative. Margins realistic. Language grounded. The smoothing era was over. Not declared, but dissolved. and once dissolved, it could not be reassembled without visible intent. That's what too late to fix it truly meant. Too late to return to quiet choreography. Too late to pretend volatility didn't exist. The only path forward was alignment, and alignment, though less glamorous, is sustainable. I had set something in motion that could not be undone. Not dramatically, structurally, and structural change leaves marks, even when no one names the catalyst. The confrontation when it came was almost understated. No raised voices, no accusations across a conference table, no dramatic revelation. It happened on a gray Thursday afternoon in early December. Daniel asked me to step into his office. His tone was neutral, professional. When I sat down, he didn't begin immediately. He closed the door gently, returned to his desk, and folded his hands. "I've been reviewing the sequence of governance reviews," he said calmly. "The audit committee received a very structured submission earlier this year." He didn't look accusatory. He looked analytical. "I'd like to understand," he continued, "why that path was chosen instead of a direct conversation." There it was. Not an allegation, an inquiry. I met his gaze steadily. "My assessment was that the pattern involved executive incentive alignment," I said. "Escalating through governance ensured structural neutrality." He absorbed that. "You believed I wouldn't have addressed it directly. I believed you were incentivized not to." Silence settled between us, not tense, just precise. He leaned back slightly. "You're not alleging misconduct." "No," I replied, "I'm alleging structural drift." That phrase landed differently. Structural drift. It removes personality. It removes blame. It focuses on system. He nodded once, slowly. "You understand what this has cost." It wasn't a threat. It was an acknowledgement. "Volatility is visible now," I said, "but fragility is reduced." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. "You could have come to me. I considered it. And I needed independence in the review." Another pause. In that moment, I saw something shift in him. Not resentment, but recognition. He wasn't a villain. He was a leader operating within incentive gravity. And I had altered the gravity. "You've always been thorough," he said quietly. "I suppose I underestimated how thorough." "That was useful," I replied evenly. A faint smile crossed his face, not amused, but reflective. "For both of us," he said. There was no hostility in the room, no personal attack, just two professionals acknowledging that something irreversible had occurred. "I won't ask whether it was you," he added. "Governance confidentiality protects everyone," which meant he knew, or strongly suspected. But proof wasn't necessary. "Understood," I said. He stood, signaling the meeting's end. "One thing," he added before I reached the door. "If you're going to operate at that level, you should consider stepping into it formally." I turned slightly. "Leadership. Oversight," he clarified. "You see architecture, that's rare." It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement, and perhaps an invitation. The confrontation ended without heat. No shouting, no humiliation, no triumph. Just clarity. When I returned to my desk, nothing outwardly changed. Emails still required responses. Reports still needed finalization. But something subtle had shifted in dynamic. I was no longer merely the technician. I was the architect who had adjusted the foundation. And he knew it. Quiet dominance isn't about defeating someone publicly. It's about altering the system so that truth becomes the path of least resistance. That afternoon proved something important to me. Power does not always respond with retaliation. Sometimes it recalibrates, and recalibration, when mutual, is stronger than exposure. There were no apologies exchanged. None were needed. The system had corrected. The volatility had surfaced. The incentives had shifted, and we both understood why. If you had asked me 3 years ago who I was, I would have said, a reliable analyst, a careful technician, someone who ensures the numbers balance. Now, when I ask myself the same question, the answer feels quieter and stronger. I am someone who understands architecture, not just spreadsheets, systems. In the months following the governance shift, my role evolved. Not through promotion announced in a company-wide email, but through responsibility. I was invited to participate in audit committee briefings regularly, not as a whistleblower, not as a disruptor, as a translator, someone who could explain how small timing decisions compound over time. Someone who could articulate the difference between compliance and resilience. Daniel and I developed a different rhythm, less hierarchical, more strategic. He still led earnings calls, still navigated investor conversations. But internally, projections were built with wider tolerance bands. Incentive metrics now included multi-year stability weightings. The choreography had softened into structure, and I had learned something about myself. For years, I thought my invisibility was weakness. I believe that because I wasn't loud, I wasn't influential. But influence doesn't always arrive through charisma. Sometimes it arrives through patience, through documentation, through understanding incentives deeply enough to anticipate outcomes. What changed most wasn't the company. It was my relationship to silence. Before, silence was protection, a way to avoid being labeled obstructive. Then, silence became strategy. Now, silence is discernment. I speak when structure requires it. I stay quiet when noise distracts from correction. I no longer need to soften my observations excessively. I present them precisely, calmly. If they challenge authority, so be it. Because I've learned that authority anchored in truth does not fear examination. I don't carry bitterness toward Daniel, or toward Ryan, or toward anyone who dismissed me early on. They operated within incentives that rewarded smooth optics. I operated within a value system that prioritizes long-term integrity. Those paths were bound to intersect eventually, and when they did, the outcome wasn't destruction. It was alignment. There is something profoundly grounding about choosing correction over exposure. I could have sought recognition, public validation, credit for initiating the review. I chose none of that because quiet dominance isn't about being seen. It's about ensuring the system sees clearly. Today, our quarterly reports are less polished and more trusted. Volatility appears where it exists. Risk footnotes are specific. Guidance reflects range, not perfection. Investors ask sharper questions. We answer them directly. Internally, I am no longer Emma from reporting. I'm consulted early when strategic decisions may shape financial narrative. My input is requested before projections are finalized. Not because I demanded it, because I demonstrated it. That is the difference. Identity is not assigned permanently. It evolves when you choose to act in alignment with your values, even when action is quiet. I'm still calm, still measured, still unlikely to dominate a room with volume. But now, when I sit at the table, I understand something deeply. Being underestimated is not a liability. It is an advantage if you know how to use it without resentment. I don't feel victorious. I feel steady, and steadiness, in finance and in life, is worth more than perfection. When people imagine corporate reckoning, they picture headlines. Investigations, public resignations, dramatic reversals. That isn't what happened here. There was no scandal splashed across financial media. No executive escorted out of the building. No speech about betrayal. What happened was quieter. The finance department's 2 perfect profit numbers didn't explode. They softened. The manipulated entries didn't become criminal charges. They became governance lessons. The delayed losses didn't destroy the company. They were absorbed, honestly this time. And the risks buried just deep enough to fool everyone, they were brought into daylight before they had the chance to become catastrophic. That's the part people underestimate about quiet correction. It doesn't humiliate. It stabilizes. For a long time, I wondered whether I should have spoken sooner, or louder, or more directly. But I've come to understand something about systems. If you attack them emotionally, they defend themselves. If you expose them structurally, they adjust. The difference is subtle, but powerful. This story was never about revenge for being dismissed. Yes, I was underestimated. Yes, I was labeled careful, anxious, overly meticulous. But that wasn't the wound that mattered. The real tension was between presentation and truth, between numbers arranged to impress and numbers arranged to endure. In the end, what looked like flawless growth had hidden vulnerabilities, not because anyone woke up intending harm, but because incentives reward smoothness more than resilience. And when smoothness becomes the goal, truth gets delayed. Not denied, delayed. I didn't act because I wanted recognition. I acted because volatility is inevitable. Markets shift, conditions change, pressure reveals structure. If the structure beneath the presentation is weak, collapse follows. If the structure is honest, volatility becomes survivable. That's the moral here. Integrity isn't dramatic. It's preventative. It's the quiet decision to correct drift before drift becomes damage. And sometimes, the most powerful position in a room isn't the loudest voice. It's the one who understands the architecture well enough to adjust it without burning it down. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever seen something others chose not to look at, if you've ever wrestled with whether silence protects you or betrays your values, I'm curious about something. When you notice structural drift in your own world, at work, in relationships, in leadership, do you confront it loudly or do you correct it quietly? I'd really like to know how you would choose.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.